A man sits alone in a small room. Outside, guards count down the hours. He has one final request. Not for mercy, not for an appeal. For food. He asks for a double cheeseburger, a strawberry milkshake, French fries, and a slice of pecan pie. The kitchen staff prepares it with care. A correctional officer carries the tray down the hallway. The condemned man eats, slowly, quietly, for the last time. This is the final meal. A ritual practiced across America's death rows for over a century. And the story behind it is far stranger, far more complicated, and far more human than most people ever realize. Some men ask for feasts. Others ask for almost nothing. One man, executed in Texas, asked for a single olive with a pit inside it, reportedly so his family could plant an olive tree in his memory. Another asked for the very food his victim was eating when he killed her. In one state, after a condemned man requested an elaborate meal he barely touched, abolished the tradition entirely. So what is the final meal, really? Is it mercy? Tradition? Psychology? Or is it something else entirely? A ritual that says more about the society carrying out an execution than the man sitting on death row? Stay with me, because every answer reveals something darker than the question. If you've ever wondered how a country that prides itself on justice handles the final hours of a condemned man, you're about to find out. Subscribe and hit the bell. This one goes deep. The tradition of the final meal is older than the American prison system itself. To understand why it exists, you have to go back, not to a courtroom or a prison, but to ancient ritual. Across cultures and centuries, the sharing of food before death carried profound symbolic weight. In medieval Europe, it was common practice to offer a condemned prisoner a meal before execution. The act was rooted partly in Christian theology, a last communion of sorts, and partly in a darker social calculation. By accepting food from the state, a prisoner was understood to have, in some ceremonial sense, forgiven his executioners. It was a transaction, a final piece. That idea crossed the Atlantic. As colonial America developed formal systems of criminal punishment, the pre-execution meal came with it. Early American execution records from the 1700s document instances of condemned prisoners being offered food and drink, sometimes alcohol, before being led to the gallows. By the time electric chairs began replacing hangings in the late 1800s, the tradition was firmly embedded in American prison culture. It wasn't legislated. It wasn't mandatory. It simply continued because it had always continued. The first documented case of a formal final meal in the modern American system is difficult to pin to a single event. But by the early 20th century, wardens across the country were routinely noting in prison logs what condemned prisoners had eaten before their executions. The practice had become, in the bureaucratic language of corrections, standard procedure. What makes the tradition genuinely complicated is who controls it and how much. Most states that retain the death penalty have some version of a final meal policy, but the specifics vary dramatically. In some states, inmates can request almost anything within a modest budget, typically between $20 and $50. In others, the meal is restricted to whatever the prison kitchen already has on hand. A few states allow outside food to be brought in from local restaurants. Most do not. Texas, the state with the highest number of executions in the modern era, changed its policy significantly in 2011. The change came after a high-profile incident involving a condemned man named Lawrence Russell Brewer, who had been convicted of participating in the brutal 1998 murder of James Byrd Jr., a black man who was chained to a pickup truck and dragged to death in Jasper, Texas. The crime was a federal hate crime. The execution was scheduled for September 21, 2011. For his final meal, Brewer requested a staggering spread: 2 chicken fried steaks, a triple meat bacon cheeseburger, a large bowl of fried okra, 1 pound of barbecue, 3 fajitas, a meat lover's pizza, a pint of ice cream, and a slab of peanut butter fudge. When the tray arrived, he reportedly didn't eat a single bite. Texas State Senator John Whitmire, who chaired the Senate Criminal Justice Committee at the time, was outraged. According to reporting from the period, He called the Department of Criminal Justice and ordered the policy changed. Within 24 hours, Texas eliminated the special final meal entirely. From that point on, condemned inmates in Texas receive whatever the general prison population is eating that day. Nothing more. It was a decision that drew sharp reactions on both sides, from people who felt the tradition was an absurd indulgence for murderers, and from those who argued it was a basic expression of human dignity at the moment of death. That tension, dignity versus punishment, sits at the center of everything that follows. The psychology of the final meal is something criminologists, prison psychologists, and philosophers have studied for decades, because it turns out what a man chooses to eat on his last night alive reveals something extraordinary about the human mind under extreme pressure. Brian Price knows this better than almost anyone. Price worked as a chef at the Polunsky Unit, the Texas death row facility, for years before the policy change. In interviews, he described preparing final meals with genuine care, treating each request as something meaningful regardless of the crime the prisoner had committed. He later wrote about the experience, describing the strange intimacy of cooking for a man who would be dead within hours. His account makes something clear. The kitchen staff almost always took the task seriously, not because they agreed with the prisoner or sympathized with the crime, but because the act of preparing food for someone is, at its most fundamental level, an act of recognition. You're acknowledging that this person exists, that they have preferences, that they are, at this moment, still human. Research into final meal requests shows consistent patterns. Dr. Brian Wansink, a food behavior researcher, co-authored a study analyzing the final meal requests of over 240 condemned prisoners in the United States. The findings were striking. On average, condemned inmates requested meals significantly larger than the average American's daily caloric intake. Comfort foods dominated: fried chicken, hamburgers, ice cream, pie. The study noted that inmates also frequently requested foods associated with childhood and family. Specific regional dishes, their mother's recipes, food that connected them, in their final hours, to a version of themselves that existed before whatever brought them to death row. Some requests were deeply personal. John Wayne Gacy, convicted of murdering 33 young men in Illinois in the 1970s, requested fried chicken, French fries, fresh strawberries, and shrimp. He had managed a Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise before his arrest. The meal was, in some distorted way, a return to something familiar. Timothy McVeigh, responsible for the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing that killed 168 people, requested 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. Nothing else. The simplicity of that request stood in stark contrast to the scale of his crime and haunted people who covered the execution. Ted Bundy reportedly declined a special meal entirely, choosing instead to eat the standard prison breakfast: steak, eggs, hash browns, juice, and coffee. Whether that was defiance, indifference, or performance, no one can say for certain. Velma Barfield, executed in North Carolina in 1984, the first woman executed in the United States after the reinstatement of capital punishment, asked for a bag of cheese doodles and a Coke. The variation is almost impossible to categorize, but researchers have noted that the act of choosing, of having, in those final hours, some form of agency over something as basic as what you eat, appears to carry significant psychological weight for condemned inmates. Prison psychologists who have spoken publicly on the topic suggest the meal functions as a coping mechanism, a small island of normalcy in circumstances that are anything but. The condemned person gets to make one decision that is entirely their own. For some, that is the most freedom they've had in years. But there is a harder question underneath all of this, one that prison reformers and legal scholars have raised repeatedly. What does it mean that a society provides this small mercy, this careful, curated final meal, while simultaneously preparing to end a human life? Is it compassion, or is it theater? The final meal does not exist in isolation. It is one moment inside a much larger system. And understanding that system means confronting some of the most uncomfortable data in American criminal justice. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, As of recent years, there are more than 2,000 inmates on death row across the United States. They wait an average of nearly 19 years between sentencing and execution. 19 years of appeals, retrials, stays of execution, and, in the cases of those who are eventually exonerated, years of wrongful imprisonment. Since 1973, more than 190 people have been exonerated from death row. They were convicted, they were sentenced to die, and they were innocent. Some of them had final meals prepared. That fact sits at the center of the debate over capital punishment in America, and it directly implicates the ritual of the final meal. Because if the system makes mistakes, then the mercy of that final tray of food was offered to someone who should never have been there. The case of Henry Lee McCollum in North Carolina is one that death penalty opponents return to repeatedly. McCollum was convicted in 1984, along with his half-brother Leon Brown, of the rape and murder of 11-year-old Sabrina Buey. Both men, who had intellectual disabilities, signed confessions they later insisted were coerced. McCollum spent 30 years on death row, 30 years of final appeal after final appeal, before DNA evidence exonerated him in 2014. He was 50 years old when he was released. He never had a final meal, but he came close enough that the question is not theoretical. The Innocence Project, which has used DNA evidence to exonerate hundreds of wrongfully convicted individuals, has documented cases in which inmates on death row came within days, sometimes hours, of execution before evidence emerged that changed everything. These cases throw the final meal tradition into a different light entirely, because the meal is not just a psychological ritual or a historical tradition. It is, in a very real sense, a marker of finality. It signals that the process is complete, that the decision is made, that what follows is not punishment, but conclusion. When a system is wrong, that marker becomes something else entirely. The legal debates around the final meal are also more complex than they first appear. Courts have generally treated the final meal as a matter of prison policy rather than constitutional right, meaning states can modify or eliminate it without triggering legal challenges. The Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, has been interpreted by courts to address the method of execution, not the pre-execution rituals surrounding it. This means the final meal exists in a kind of legal gray zone. It is offered not because the condemned has a right to it, but because the institution chooses to offer it. And institutions change their minds. Several states have modified or significantly restricted final meal policies in recent decades. Some, like Texas, eliminated the special meal entirely after the Brewer incident. Others have imposed strict budget caps or limited requests to items available from the prison commissary. Meanwhile, the broader conversation about capital punishment in America has shifted significantly. According to Gallup polling, support for the death penalty has declined steadily over the past several decades, dropping from a peak of 80% in 1994 to figures closer to 50% in recent surveys. More states have abolished capital punishment. Federal executions have been carried out in clusters and then paused again under successive administrations. The final meal tradition may be older than the electric chair, but whether it will outlast the institution it serves, that is a question with no clean answer. You're halfway through this story, and we haven't even gotten to the strangest final meal requests ever recorded, or the man who used his to send a message no one in that prison could ignore. Keep watching. Kindly subscribe and share. There are final meal stories that have passed into something close to legend inside the American correction system, not because of who the inmates were, but because of what they chose and why. The story of Victor Feger has been cited in academic papers, journalism, and death penalty debates for decades. Feger was executed in Iowa in 1963 for the kidnapping and murder of a physician. For his final meal, he requested a single unpitted olive. The symbolism was deliberate. Feger told prison officials he hoped an olive tree would grow from his grave, a symbol of peace. Iowa executed him on March 15, 1963. He was the last person executed by the federal government before a moratorium took hold. the same moratorium that would eventually result in the Supreme Court's 1972 decision in Furman versus Georgia, which effectively suspended capital punishment in the United States for 4 years. The olive pit was placed in the breast pocket of his burial suit. Stories like this reveal something that goes largely undiscussed in the coverage of capital punishment. Condemned inmates are thinking carefully about what they leave behind. The final meal is not always about comfort or nostalgia. For some, it is the last available act of communication with the world. Ricky Ray Rector was executed in Arkansas in January 1992. Rector had shot a police officer and then turned the gun on himself, suffering severe brain damage that left him with a mental capacity, according to those who knew him, of a child. His execution became highly controversial, and his final meal became one of the most discussed in American history. Rector ate most of his meal, but set aside a portion of pecan pie. He told the prison guard he was saving it for later. He did not understand that there was no later. His execution was carried out that night. The pecan pie sat untouched in his cell. The case raised profound questions about the execution of individuals with severe cognitive impairment, questions that reached the Supreme Court and contributed to legal debates that continue today. The Supreme Court's 2002 decision in Atkins versus Virginia held that executing the intellectually disabled constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Rector's case had preceded that ruling by a decade. Then there is the case of James Edward Smith, executed in Texas in 1990. Smith requested a clump of dirt as his final meal, claiming it was needed for a voodoo ritual. The request was denied. He was given yogurt instead. What these stories share is not their darkness or their strangeness. It is the fact that in each case, a human being, regardless of what they had done, was navigating the most impossible psychological terrain imaginable, facing a death they could not prevent in a facility designed to contain them completely, with almost no agency over anything in their lives. And the one thing they could control, the one small window of choice, was what they ate. Prison chaplains and mental health professionals who have accompanied condemned prisoners in their final hours have spoken in interviews about this dimension of the final meal. The act of eating, of tasting something familiar with something longed for, can anchor a person to something human when everything else has been stripped away. One chaplain described sitting with a condemned man as he ate fried catfish, collard greens, and cornbread, food his grandmother had made for him as a child. The man didn't talk much. He just ate slowly, and for a while, he was somewhere else. That, perhaps, is the most honest answer to what the final meal is. Not a policy, not a tradition, not a legal framework. It is a threshold, a last connection to life before the door closes. The final meal has evolved, and continues to evolve, as America's relationship with the death penalty shifts beneath it. In states that have abolished capital punishment, the question is moot. But in the 27 states that retain the death penalty as of recent years, the tradition persists in various forms. And in the federal system, which resumed executions under the Trump administration in 2020 after a 17-year pause, the final meal is still offered. The 13 federal executions carried out between July 2020 and January 2021 reignited public debate about capital punishment and, inevitably, about the rituals surrounding it. Several of the condemned inmates made notable final meal requests. Daniel Lewis Lee, the first federal inmate executed in 17 years, requested a final meal that prison staff provided. His execution was carried out after last-minute legal challenges failed. Across the country, the people responsible for carrying out executions, wardens, correctional officers, chaplains, and medical staff, have spoken in the years since their involvement about the psychological weight of the process. Many describe the final meal as the moment that stays with them longest. Not the execution itself, but the hours before it. The meal, the waiting, the strange normalcy of food in a space where nothing is normal. Former Warden Jim Willett, who oversaw 89 executions of the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas, the facility where most Texas executions are carried out, has spoken publicly about the toll the process takes on those who administer it. He described the final hours before an execution as among the most psychologically demanding of his career. The rituals, including the meal, existed, he suggested, as much for the staff as for the condemned. There's also the question of witnesses. In most states, executions are witnessed by a small group of people. Victims' family members, the condemned prisoners' family members, prison officials, and media representatives. The final meal takes place hours before the witnesses arrive. It is a private ritual. The condemned person eats alone or with a chaplain. For the families of victims, the knowledge that the person who killed their loved one received a carefully prepared final meal can be profoundly painful. Several victims' family members who have spoken publicly about executions they witnessed have described complicated feelings about this, ranging from indifference to deep anger. Other victims' family members have expressed the opposite. Some have said they did not want the execution carried out in their name at all, that the entire process, the decades of appeals, the execution itself, the final meal, the ceremony of death, offered them no closure, only prolonged anguish. The final meal, in this sense, is a mirror. It reflects back at society the contradictions it has not resolved. The desire to be humane within a process that is, by its nature, the deliberate ending of a life. The wish to be civilized within an institution that many legal scholars, physicians, and ethicists argue cannot be civilized. International perspectives make the contrast sharper. The United States is the only country in the developed Western world that retains capital punishment. Among nations that do carry out executions, the United States is notable for the degree of procedural ritual surrounding the process, the lengthy appeals, the last rites, and yes, the final meal. In nations where capital punishment is carried out with speed and without ceremony, there is no final meal tradition. The ritual, paradoxically, belongs to a system that prides itself on process. So what is the final meal? It is mercy and theater at once. It is a century-old ritual born from ancient custom, shaped by institutional policy, interpreted by every condemned person differently, and witnessed, in its aftermath, by everyone willing to look. It is a country's way of saying, we see you as human, and then proceeding anyway. The question of whether those two things can coexist, the recognition and the execution, is one America has not answered. And every tray carried down every death row corridor in the country carries that unresolved question with it. The next time you hear about an execution, about the crime, the sentence, the years of legal battles, remember that somewhere in that story, there is a meal, a small, strange, human moment, a man or a woman choosing what to eat one last time. And in that moment, before everything else, they are just a person at a table. If this story made you think differently about something, drop it in the comments. And if you want to go deeper into the systems, the cases, and the questions that don't have clean answers, the next video is right there. Click it. You already know you want to know more.